Monday mornings at Asheville Community Hospital follow a rhythm. The phones ring, nurses in blue scrubs shift between patients, carts clatter against linoleum floors. It's routine chaos, the kind every hospital staff knows by heart. But that morning, a man named Walter Johnson stumbled through the sliding glass doors, and everything in the lobby changed. He wasn't a stranger to the ER. At 72, retired from his years as a forest ranger, Walter had carried his share of scratches and sprains into clinics. This time was different. His shirt was damp, his steps uneven, his hand pressed tight against his chest. Every nurse in the room recognized the posture of a man in cardiac trouble. A gurney rolled forward almost instantly, and then the door slid open a second time. Through them padded a black bear cub. The cub's fur looked ragged, a patch on his shoulder still raw from healing wounds. He wasn't snarling. He wasn't lost. He walked with purpose, head low, pace steady until he reached Walter's side. In the middle of a sterile hospital lobby where wild animals had no business standing, the sight froze everyone. Phones dropped. A receptionist's hand hovered above the keyboard. Even the security guard, trained to step forward, held still. It wasn't fear that stopped them. It was disbelief, because the bear cub didn't lunge. He sat leaned lightly against Walter's leg and stayed there as if the two had been traveling together all along. Moments like this catch people between instinct and understanding. Instinct says wild animal danger. Understanding says, wait, something else is happening. Hospitals are built for urgency, for split-second choices. Yet here, time stretched long enough for everyone to see what their eyes had almost refused to believe. A man in pain, and beside him a wild creature acting like a companion. Nurse Jillian Carter, who had worked in trauma care for 12 years, moved first. She crouched slightly, voice low and measured. "Sir, we're here. We'll help you. Stay calm." Her glance flicked to the cub. His amber eyes followed every hand that reached toward Walter, but he didn't move. He just breathed shallow and even matching Walter's pace. An elderly man arriving with chest pain is not unusual, but an elderly man arriving with a bear cub that belongs in wildlife documentaries, not daily hospital logs. Still there it was. No staged camera trick, no viral animal video edited for effect. Just real life pressing in on the people who happen to be present. It's easy to assume wild animals only survive in forests and that they disappear at the edge of the human towns. Yet black bears live closer to us than most realize. In the Blue Ridge Mountains, they cross driveways at dawn, tip backyard feeders, and climb orchard trees. Still, a bear cub walking through hospital doors belongs to a category few know how to process. Doctors pulled Walter toward the trauma bay. He tried to speak but only managed a rasp. The cub followed, nails tapping against the floor. Security blocked the doorway, uncertain. A doctor shook his head. "Let him. The animal isn't panicking." He knows this man, and that statement carried weight. Because in animal rescue work, handlers know one truth. Loyalty doesn't form by accident. Trust comes from time, from survival, shared from a memory of kindness. The cub wasn't lost. He was guarding. That made every nurse, every orderly pause before calling for animal control. They understood they weren't just looking at a patient and a hazard. They were looking at a pair. Later, when the surveillance tape was replayed, the staff watched the scene frame by frame. Walter was leaning heavily on the door frame, and just seconds behind him, the cub. His gait wasn't clumsy. He had followed the trail through town, past traffic, past noise, past sidewalks lined with people until he arrived exactly where Walter had gone. An example comes from a similar case recorded in Colorado years earlier, where a black bear cub followed a hiker into a ranger station after its mother had been struck by a vehicle. Biologists explained then what experts would explain here: young bears imprint when stress and survival force them to seek comfort. Most never survive that separation, but once in a rare while, they choose a human figure to follow. That lesson reshaped the way staff saw the moment. What looked impossible was in truth a window into instinct. Wild animals do not rationalize like we do. They move by need, hunger, fear, memory of safety. The cub's actions said more than words. This is the one who helped me. I go where he goes. From a fresh perspective, what walked into the ER wasn't simply a man in crisis or a wild animal out of place. It was a story of interdependence, an old ranger who had given his strength to a creature weaker than himself, and that creature in turn refused to leave him. Viewers often look for wild animal stories online, rare animals caught on film, forest animals emerging into towns, animal rescue clips where human and beast blur the lines of fear. Those videos trend because they reveal something primal, the reminder that nature notices us. That even in an age of polished technology and polished floors, the ancient thread between people and wild animals still tugs. So, what lesson rests in the opening scene of this story? That loyalty isn't owned, it's earned. That compassion given to the vulnerable does not always vanish into the forest. Sometimes it returns padding on four paws across the impossible divide, even into a place as unnatural for a bear cub as a hospital lobby. The staff at Asheville Community Hospital wouldn't forget the morning their jobs changed shape. They had trained for emergencies, for heart attacks, for broken bones. They had not trained for this, a man and a cub walking in together as though bound by an invisible rope. And yet they adapted. They allowed space, chose trust over fear, and gave the pair a chance. And that decision set the course for everything that followed: the medical fight to save Walter's life, the investigation into where the cub had come from, the questions raised about animal rescue, and the community's reaction once the story spread beyond hospital walls. Because if a black bear cub can walk into a hospital beside a man, what other lines between wilderness and humanity might not be as solid as we believe? Long before Asheville Community Hospital saw the sight of a black bear cub padding through its lobby, there was Walter Johnson living alone at the edge of Pisgah Forest. His story didn't begin with that Monday morning. It began in a cabin where silence had replaced laughter and routine had replaced purpose. Walter had once worn the ranger's patch with pride. For 3 decades he walked trails, patrolled campgrounds, and explained to families why leaving food outside a tent invited trouble from black bears and raccoons. He had grown older in those woods, knowing every ridge by memory, every stream by sound. When he retired, the uniform went into a box, but the rhythm of the forest never left him. Each dawn he rose before the sun, laced his boots, worn smooth by years, and walked. People in town knew him as quiet, courteous, perhaps a little withdrawn. Since Margaret, his wife of 40 years, had passed, they'd see him at the grocery, leaning over to read labels with the same patience he once used on trail maps. He spoke little, but when he did, it was often about the seasons or the animals. He remembered dates not by holidays but by migrations, when the warblers arrived, when the black bears left their dens. In the cabin, photographs lined a shelf. Margaret is smiling in a canoe. Their daughter, now living states away, is holding a beagle pup, and one of Walter himself, decades younger, carrying a rescued hawk to a wildlife sanctuary. These weren't decorations. They were anchors to remind him that once his days were filled with people and purpose. Now his closest conversations were with the forest itself. But silence does not mean absence. Those who have lived long enough near wild animals know they notice you as surely as you notice them. The deer at dusk, the owl in the pine, the black bear tracks pressed into soft earth. Walter carried with him a respect that never turned into fear. That respect had defined him as a ranger, and would define the choice he made when he later found the cub. It is important to understand what that background means. Most people who encounter wild animals panic freeze or call animal control. Walter's instinct was shaped by decades of observation. He had seen mistakes: campers feeding bear cubs peanut butter sandwiches, hikers running when they should have stood still. He had also seen acts of compassion that worked: a fellow ranger untangling a fox from discarded fishing line, a family guiding an injured deer to shade until rescue crews arrived. Each moment taught him the line between interference and stewardship. That line was not always clear. But Walter believed in a principle: if you can prevent suffering without causing harm, you should. He carried that principle even in retirement. On long walks he often picked up litter, others left behind, muttering to himself about responsibility. He planted extra rows of beans in his garden, not just for himself, but for the rabbits and deer he knew would nibble at the edges. To man, it looked eccentric. To him, it was continuity. An example that captures Walter's way of thinking came years earlier. On a patrol near the Blue Ridge Parkway, he found a young black bear stuck in a culvert pipe. The cub thrashed too deep for its mother to reach. Walter didn't rush. He knelt at the edge, spoke low, and waited until the cub paused before lowering a branch. It clawed, clung, and finally scrambled out. The mother watched from the trees. Walter didn't claim credit. He simply brushed dirt from his uniform and walked away, leaving space for the wild to resume its rhythm. That memory returned to him often after Margaret's passing. She had been the one to remind him that gentleness is strength. He once told a neighbor that losing her felt like walking without a compass. But in quiet moments, he found her voice in his head, especially when he encountered an animal in need. It was as if she whispered, "Don't turn away. Compassion doesn't retire. A badge, a uniform, a paycheck, those can end." But the habit of choosing kindness, even when unseen, continues to shape a person long after their titles are gone. From a fresh perspective, Walter's life shows that solitude can hold purpose when linked to responsibility. He was not a man chasing adventures, he was a man carrying memory forward. For some, that might feel like emptiness. For Walter, it became readiness. Readiness to respond when life, whether human or animal, crossed his path in need. In American towns near wilderness, people debate the boundaries between wild animals and community life. Should bears be relocated if they wander into neighborhoods? Should feeding bans be stricter? Should animal sanctuaries intervene more quickly? Walter lived in that gray space. He believed coexistence required trust. Trust that humans could act wisely and trust that wild animals could respond when given respect. That trust would be tested on the morning he first heard a cry in the forest. But before reaching that turning point, it matters to note the weight he carried into that day. At 72, his body did not always keep up with his spirit. His heart strained on steep inclines. His hands trembled when gripping an axe, yet he still walked the ridge trails slower now with a cane. Because walking meant listening to wind, to birds, to silence that often healed more than words could. The town rarely saw more than fragments of this man. They saw him at the post office, nodding politely. They did not see him pause to leave an apple near a hollow log for raccoons. They saw him buy oatmeal in bulk. They did not see him ladle that same oatmeal into a bowl for an injured stray dog one winter. This was Walter's pattern quiet acts that few witnessed, but that shaped the bond he later formed with the bear cub. Why does this matter to the story? Because it reframes what happened at the hospital. The cub's loyalty wasn't magic. It wasn't random. It grew from seeds planted long before in a man's steady choices, to notice, to care, to extend trust beyond his own needs. When you understand Walter's background, the sight of a cub walking at his side is not simply unbelievable. It is consistent with a life already lived in companionship with the wild. In animal rescue communities, stories like these are rare, but not unheard of. There are cases of forest animals adopting human guardians briefly when survival demanded it. Wildlife photographers have documented black bear cubs trailing hikers for miles before being redirected to sanctuaries. Each case raises questions about boundaries, but each also highlights resilience. Nature adapts. And sometimes humans must adapt too. Walter never considered himself remarkable. Yet his story illustrates something larger than one man's bond with one cub. It illustrates the ongoing conversation between people and wild animals in shared landscapes. The forests of North Carolina are not empty backdrops. They are living neighborhoods. Walter simply treated them as such. As the cub pressed against his leg in that hospital lobby, staff saw an elderly man in need and a wild animal out of place. But those who knew Walter might have nodded quietly, recognizing a pattern. Of course, a creature would follow him. Of course, loyalty would form. That was who he had always been. And that perspective shifts the mystery. The real question is not why the cub follows him, but why wouldn't it As Walter lay in the trauma bay later that morning, doctors fighting to stabilize his heartbeat, the cub waited outside the doors. Staff debated, security argued, but the decision to let the cub near came only after someone whispered, "Look at his eyes. He belongs here." Walter couldn't hear that sentence, but if he had, he might have smiled, because belonging, whether for man or animal, had been his quiet pursuit all along. The threads of his story lead us now toward the moment that changed everything. One morning, walk one sound in the woods, one decision to follow it. That cry he heard would transform his solitude into connection and his quiet acts of compassion into a story that spread far beyond Asheville. Walter's boots sank lightly into the damp soil of Pisgah Forest. Morning light filtered through branches, but he wasn't watching the trees. He was listening. For years he had walked this same trail, cane, steady in his left-hand breath, measured eyes on the ground for signs of forest animals. He knew the difference between a squirrel's chatter and a crow's call, the rhythm of deer moving versus wind pushing leaves. That morning, it wasn't any of those sounds that stopped him. It was a cry, not loud, not sharp, but steady, a high-pitched whimper that didn't fit the forest's usual chorus. He paused, head tilted. Birds paused too, as though the woods were holding their breath. He stepped off the trail, moving more slowly now, following the faint sound down a slope. Each step felt heavier, not because of his years, but because of the unknown waiting. The whimper grew clearer. Behind a tangle of fallen branches near an old hunting shed, he saw it, a black bear cub. Its paw caught in barbed wire body, trembling with every pull. The cub was small enough to fit under his arm, yet strong enough to thrash when fear took hold. Its fur was matted with mud, its eyes wide with panic. Walter's first instinct wasn't to rush. He stopped a few paces back, lowering himself slightly, cane planted beside him. He knew sudden movement would push the cub into frenzy, and frenzy meant deeper wounds. His voice, rough from years in the mountain air, softened as he spoke, easy now. Easy. He'd used that tone before, once to calm a stray dog in winter, once to coax a frightened child out of a storm drain. The tone wasn't commanding. It was reassuring. The cub stilled for a moment, enough for him to take a step closer. He saw the wire, biting into its skin, fresh blood seeping. The injury wasn't fatal yet, but it soon would be if the cub kept fighting. This is where Walter's years as a ranger mattered. He didn't see a wild animal as just a danger. He saw a situation, stress response, injury, survival. He spoke again, lower this time, and crouched until his knees ached. Slowly, he reached for the pocket knife he always carried. The cub flinched but didn't pull. With patience, he cut the wire strand by strand until the paw was free. The moment it broke loose, the cub stumbled backward. Walter expected it to flee into the trees. Most wild animals do. But instead, the cub stood breathing hard, watching him. Its body shook with exhaustion. Then, unsteadily, it sat. Walter lowered the knife, tucking it away. He didn't move closer. He didn't need to. This is the point many would have left, telling themselves nature would take its course. But Walter saw more. The cub's weakness, the way it struggled to keep upright, told him the forest alone wouldn't heal it. A young black bear without its mother rarely survives. Studies show survival rates plummet when cubs are separated too early. Sometimes less than 30% make it through their first year. For Walter, statistics weren't numbers. They were realities he had seen on patrols, young cubs found lifeless near roadsides or camps. So he made a choice. He pulled off his jacket, laid it on the ground, and slid it gently under the cub. The animal resisted for a moment, then slumped against the fabric. Walter lifted carefully, tucking the small body close to his chest. The cub's claws grazed his arm but didn't dig. It was too weak to fight. Carrying it back toward the trail, he whispered as if speaking to a child, "You're safe now. We'll figure this out." An example of such decisions exists outside Walter's story. In Alaska, rangers once carried an orphaned bear cub out of the tundra after its mother had been shot illegally. The cub survived because someone chose action over hesitation. Wildlife sanctuaries later traced that rescue as the beginning of a cub's life that grew into adulthood in safety. Those cases are rare, but they prove what Walter believed: one choice can alter the line between life and death for an animal. The lesson in this moment isn't about recklessness, it's about discernment. Most people know they shouldn't touch wild animals, but sometimes leaving a creature tangled in a man-made wire isn't respect, it's neglect. Walter's act wasn't ownership. It was the responsibility for the harm that came from human intrusion into the woods. From a fresh perspective, the rescue reveals more than compassion. It shows the thin space where human mistakes meet animal suffering. The barbed wire was no accident of nature. It was left behind by someone who had long since gone, but its danger lingered. The cub paid the price. Walter simply answered the debt. As he reached the cabin, he set the cub near the hearth on a folded blanket. He boiled water, mixed it with honey and oatmeal, and placed it in a shallow bowl. The cub sniffed, then lapped weakly. Walter watched, not interfering, just waiting. It was in that waiting that something unspoken passed between them: recognition. One had chosen to stay, the other had chosen to help. In animal rescue work, handlers describe a shift that happens when a wild creature accepts temporary safety. It's not domestication, it's surrender to care. That surrender often lasts only until the animal is strong enough to leave. But sometimes bonds outlast necessity. This was one of those times. Wildlife biologists explain that bear cubs are guided by scent and memory. They recognize those who offer relief from pain. They follow those patterns when fear rises again. That explains why weeks later, the cub trailed Walter's steps as faithfully as a dog. But at this moment, it was just beginning the first encounter where trust cracked open between man and animal. Walter sat near the hearth cane, propped against the chair, watching the cub curl against the blanket. His body ached, chest heavy, but his mind was clear. He remembered Margaret's voice in his head. Don't turn away. He hadn't, and that decision would ripple far beyond his cabin. This encounter reshaped not only the cub's future, but also Walter's. Solitude had pressed on him for years. That morning in the forest, a whimper broke through it. Purpose returned in the form of a fragile life. The next days would deepen the bond, test Walter's strength, and raise questions about what happens when wild animals step into human lives. But for now, the story rests in that single morning, boots sinking in soil, a cry from behind the brush, and a man bending down with patience instead of fear. And that is the pivot where mystery enters. Because what began as a chance rescue would not stay hidden in a cabin. It would one day walk through the sliding glass doors of Asheville Community Hospital, astonishing everyone who saw it. Walter never set out to keep secrets. His years as a ranger taught him rules as clearly as trees mark the forest line. Don't feed wild animals, don't blur the boundary between their world and ours. Yet in the days after he freed the black bear cub from the barbed wire, silence seemed like the only choice. If neighbors knew, they'd call animal control. If he called a wildlife rescue center, the cub might be taken before it had the strength to survive the transfer. So Walter told no one. At first, secrecy meant small actions. Oatmeal bowls left on the hearth. A basin of water is refreshed each morning. The cub slept in a corner near the wood stove, lifting its head each time Walter moved. When Walter stepped outside to split wood, the cub followed to the doorway, eyes fixed, ears twitching. It was cautious, but it did not leave. By the third day, it trailed him to the porch. By the end of the week, it trotted beside him across the yard, clumsy but determined. Walter chuckled once when it tumbled nose first into a bucket, then shook itself off as if embarrassed. He hadn't laughed like that in years. The secrecy deepened when he realized the cub was watching him not just for food, but for rhythm. When Walter rose at dawn, the cub stirred. When Walter paused during chores, the cub lay down too. They moved as though bound by an invisible rope. For a man who had eaten alone for months, the simple sound of paws padding behind him was companionship too sharp to ignore. Still, he carried conflict inside. Each night as he stirred soup for himself and warmed milk for the cub, he remembered the lectures he'd once given tourists. A fed bear is a dead bear. Feeding wild animals creates dependence, and dependence leads to danger for them, for people, for communities. He knew those words were still true. And yet here he was, stirring oatmeal for a black bear cub in his kitchen. The explanation perhaps lies in what grief and solitude do to judgment. Walter wasn't reckless. He was careful, patient, steady. But loneliness bends rules. And compassion, once set in motion, rarely stops halfway. The cub was already injured by human neglect, the barbed wire left rusting in the woods. Helping it heal wasn't changing nature. It was repairing damage. A wildlife sanctuary could come later, once strength returned. Until then, secrecy kept the cub safe. Examples of such hidden bonds exist, though they often remain whispered stories. In Vermont, an old farmer once nursed a fawn through winter storms, feeding it hay meant for his cattle. When spring came, the fawn rejoined the herd that grazed the valley, but it returned each evening to stand at the fence until the farmer appeared. In Montana, a miner carried a raven with a broken wing in his lunchbox for weeks until it could fly again. These aren't tales of ownership. They're moments of quiet guardianship, choices made away from headlines born of human instinct to protect. The lesson in secrecy is complex. On the surface, it might seem dishonest keeping a wild animal hidden, but beneath it is a truth about responsibility. Sometimes doing the right thing for a creature doesn't fit neatly into rules. Sometimes the heart recognizes urgency before the law does. Walter's perspective shifted as the days stretched into weeks. What began as secrecy became routine. He found himself speaking aloud again, narrating his chores to the cub. Stacking wood now. Don't chew the boots, or storm coming. Stay close. Words filled the cabin again, bouncing off walls that had been too quiet since Margaret's absence. The cub listened, head tilting, as if understanding tone, if not meaning, and the cub gave back more than presents. When Walter coughed hard one evening, dropping his cane, the cub nudged it toward him with its nose. When Walter dozed in the chair, the cub settled nearby, body pressed to the floor as if guarding. Loyalty was no longer one-sided. It had become mutual. From a fresh perspective, the secrecy itself reveals something rarely seen in animal rescue stories. Most viral animal videos show the public moment, the release, the applause, the sanctuary staff smiling. What they don't show are the long hidden days in between, the nights of uncertainty, the mornings of trial and error, the human doubts about whether help will even work. Walter's secrecy wasn't about deception. It was about honoring those hidden days where the bond deepens in silence. Wildlife experts often warn against humanizing wild animals. And they're right. Bears aren't pets, cubs aren't puppies. Yet psychologists also note the healing power of animal presence, even when temporary. Studies in senior communities reveal lower blood pressure, improved sleep, and reduced depression among elders who interact with animals. Walter wasn't reading those studies. He was living them each time he felt the ache in his chest ease when the cub leaned against his leg. But secrecy couldn't last forever. One afternoon, Walter's neighbor stopped by to deliver mail left at the wrong box. The cub, hearing footsteps, padded to the door. Walter barely managed to guide it back before the knock came. He accepted the envelope with shaking hands, forcing a casual smile. When the neighbor left, he closed the door quickly, heart pounding. He realized then how fragile his secrecy was. How long could he keep this hidden? What would happen when the cub grew larger, when the neighbors noticed tracks, when the community found out? His plan was simple: gain the cub enough strength and contact the local animal sanctuary. But as days turned to weeks, making that call felt harder. Letting go of the bond felt like losing Margaret all over again, and yet deep down Walter knew the truth. The cub wasn't his to keep. He was a caretaker, not an owner. The forest still called the cub, even if for now it followed Walter. The mystery lingered. Would the bond survive release, or would it vanish the moment the cub returned to the wild? That question stayed unanswered until the crisis came not from the cub, but from Walter's own body. His chest pains grew sharper, his breath shorter. He ignored them at first, muttering that it was age. But one stormy morning, the pain dropped him to his knees. The cub whined, pawing at his arm. And what happened next would take secrecy out of his hands forever. Because the cub didn't flee into the woods, it stayed. And it followed him down the mountain path straight into the human world. The storm broke just before dawn. Rain hammered the tin roof of Walter's cabin and thunder rolled across the Blue Ridge like drums. Inside, the black bear cub stirred restlessly. Walter sat in his chair, rubbing his chest. The pain had been building for weeks. First a dull ache, then sharper. That morning it struck hard, dropping him forward, breath caught like a knot in his throat. He tried to stand leaning on his cane, but his legs buckled. The cub whined, circling him, pawing at his knee. Walter pressed his palm against the wooden table, forcing himself upright. His voice came in gasps. "Not yet. Gotta make it." He reached for his jacket, though his hands shook too much to button it. When the door swung open, rain hit them both. Walter stepped into it unsteady, leaning on the cane, his free hand clutching his chest. The cub followed, paws splashing through puddles. Every few steps Walter faltered. Each time the cub stopped too, waiting, whining softly before nudging him forward again. The path down the mountain was familiar, but brutal in the storm. Mud sucked at his boots, water spilled across rocks, and branches clawed at his sleeves. He slipped once, falling to his knees. The cub pressed against him as if anchoring him in place until he could rise. Somehow, step by step, they reached the narrow road that curved toward town. And that's when the extraordinary began. Most wild animals flee from noise, from the smell of asphalt, from cars passing too close. This cub didn't. He walked at Walter's side, nose low, pacing with him. Instinct should have pulled him back to the forest, but memory and bond overruled instinct. Scientists explain it this way: young black bears rely on scent and pattern when separated from their mothers. They follow what feels safe, what feels familiar. For this cub's safety meant Walter. An example proves the point. In Yellowstone, rangers documented a yearling grizzly that trailed a particular hiker for hours after being startled from its den. Not aggression, but recognition, choosing a steady figure as an anchor. What happened with Walter and the cub followed the same principle, only deeper. This wasn't just hours. These were weeks of companionship crystallized into one crisis moment. Cars slowed as the pair emerged onto the outskirts of Asheville. A man soaked by rain, hunched with pain, and a bear cub padding beside him, an image so strange that drivers blinked twice. One snapped a photo on a phone. Another called the police, reporting an old man with a bear loose near the hospital. By the time Walter reached the glass doors of Asheville Community Hospital, his shirt was drenched, his breath ragged. The automatic doors slid open with a hiss. He stumbled forward and the cub entered behind him. The lobby froze. A receptionist's pen dropped. A nurse, mid-sentence, fell silent. Security instinctively reached for radios, but the cub didn't lunge or panic. He sat close to Walter's leg, eyes scanning every movement around him. The storm still echoed outside, but here in the sterile light, the wild and the human collided in one impossible scene. Doctors rushed forward, calling for a gurney. Walter tried to speak but collapsed against their arms. As they lifted him, the cub whined and pressed forward. Security stepped in, blocking his way. He didn't growl. He didn't strike. He simply stood tense, unwilling to let Walter vanish. It was a nurse, Jillian Carter, who said softly, "Let him. He's not here by accident. Against protocol, they allowed it." The cub padded forward, stopping just shy of the gurney, head low, as Walter was wheeled toward the trauma bay. For the staff, this was more than an emergency. It was a living contradiction, a wild animal behaving with restraint inside a hospital. Later, animal behaviorists would explain that cubs sometimes mirror the energy of those they bond with. Walter's calm patience had been imprinted on this cub. Where another bear might have panicked, this one waited. The lesson here is about trust built long before a crisis. Loyalty isn't forged in a single act. It's the accumulation of moments feeding soothing walking side by side that prepares an animal or a person to stay when fear could drive them away. From a fresh perspective, the hospital walk reframes what we assume about boundaries. We believe hospitals are human-only spaces, sanctuaries of medicine and control. Yet that morning, the sterile walls bent to admit a creature from the forest. It wasn't chaos. It wasn't an attack. It was an act of quiet insistence. Where Walter goes, I go. Community reactions began instantly. Staff snapped photos through glass doors. A patient waiting for discharge recorded a shaky video as the cub paced near the trauma room. Within hours, those clips spread across local news and social media. Headlines read, "Black bear cub walks into hospital with elderly man." Animal lovers flooded comment sections calling it miraculous, comparing it to famous wildlife rescue stories. Skeptics argued it was dangerous, reckless proof that humans shouldn't blur wild boundaries. The divide mirrored the larger conversation about wildlife rescue across the country: compassion versus caution, loyalty versus law. Yet for those inside the ER, debate faded against what they saw with their own eyes. A cub pressed close to the trauma bay doors, refusing to move, as if willing Walter to survive. An example from another case underscores why it struck them so deeply. In Oregon, a rescue dog once chased a paramedic's ambulance for miles after its owner collapsed, arriving at the hospital alongside the vehicle. The loyalty shocked bystanders then, but loyalty from a black bear cub, that was something few believed possible. The small lesson here lies in humility. We assume we understand animals, slotting them into categories: wild, domestic, dangerous, safe. But sometimes reality unsettles those boxes. Sometimes a wild animal shows patience, faithfulness, and restraint more clearly than we expect from ourselves. From another perspective, the hospital walk symbolizes a bridge. A man at the end of his strength, a creature at the beginning of its life. Both battered by circumstance, both needing each other, both stepping across a boundary that should have kept them apart. That bridge became visible the moment they entered the hospital side by side. Doctors worked fast in trauma room 2, monitors beeping, oxygen flowing. Walter drifted in and out, clutching a nurse's hand. Outside, the cub paced, nails clicking on tile. Security urged removing it. Staff hesitated. Then one voice said, "If he makes it part of it, is because that cub brought him here. Let him stay." And so the cub stayed, lying near the door, ears twitching at every sound inside. Community members who later heard the story debated what mattered most: the man's survival, the cub's loyalty, or the fact that a hospital adapted its rules for something extraordinary. But within those walls, it wasn't philosophy. It was practical. You don't separate a guardian from the one he guards. By evening, local reporters gathered outside. Police officers spoke cautiously about public safety. The wildlife sanctuary director was called for advice. But the heart of the story remained simple: an elderly man fighting for his life and a bear cub waiting for him. And that set the stage for what came next: the investigation. Because the question lingered: where had the cub come from? How had it learned to follow Walter so precisely? And what did the forest still hide about their story? By late afternoon, the hospital lobby had calmed. Walter lay in intensive care machines, humming steady rhythms. The black bear cub rested on a blanket outside his room, watched by security but undisturbed. Staff whispered about what they had seen, but the bigger questions fell to law enforcement. Where had this cub come from? How had it stayed with Walter through town? And what did it mean for public safety? Detective Ryan Mitchell arrived first, joined by Ranger Emily Hayes from the State Wildlife Division. Ryan was deliberate, notebook always ready. Emily, a ranger for 20 years, carried the quiet authority of someone who had spent her life reading forest signs. They spoke with nurses, watched the grainy security footage of Walter pushing through the rain with the cub beside him. The evidence was clear: this wasn't a chance. The cub had chosen to follow him. Ryan asked the practical questions. Was Walter keeping the animal? How long had he hidden it? Emily asked different ones. Where in the forest had they first crossed paths? How had the cub survived this long? Those questions led to a decision they needed to follow: Walter's trail back into Pisgah. The next morning, Emily led a small team of rangers, a detective, and 2 volunteers from a local animal sanctuary. They walked the muddy road Walter had staggered down, the cub's paw prints still visible beside his boot marks. The trail curved into the trees up toward Baobab, the ridge where Walter lived. At his cabin, they found the first signs. A blanket by the hearth fur clinging to the fabric. Empty bowls with traces of oatmeal. Scratch marks along the porch post at cub height. These weren't random. They told a story of weeks of care. Ryan wrote notes carefully, but Emily crouched to touch the marks, nodding. He nursed it, no doubt. Some would call that a violation. State law forbids keeping wild animals without permits. Yet others saw something else, a man trying to repair harm caused by human neglect. In the shed near the trail, they found the barbed wire tangled and cut. Emily lifted it carefully, shaking her head. Left by hunters years ago. He freed the cub here. The explanation unfolded step by step. Walter had discovered the cub injured, brought it home, and kept it safe until it grew strong enough to follow him. That explained the loyalty at the hospital. That explained the quiet bond seen in the footage. Examples of such investigations are scattered across wildlife rescue records. In Maine, officers once traced an orphaned moose calf back to a cabin where an elderly woman had been bottle feeding it in secret. In Wyoming, rangers found a den where a fox kit had been sheltered by a retired teacher. In both cases, officials faced the same dilemma: enforce the law or acknowledge compassion. The lesson in these stories isn't about ignoring rules. It's about seeing nuance. Wildlife laws protect animals from exploitation, but sometimes those who break them do so to preserve life, not harm it. Walter's choice walked that fine line. From a fresh perspective, the investigation revealed not just evidence of care, but also evidence of solitude. In Walter's cabin, aside from the bowls and blanket, there were books stacked by his chair, photos of his late wife, and letters unopened on the table. The cub hadn't filled just space, it had filled silence. That truth shaped how Emily spoke later at the sanctuary meeting. He didn't keep it for ownership. He kept it because both of them needed it. As the team followed further into the forest, they noted paths the cub had traveled, small hollows where it might have rested. Every track showed the same pattern: the cub stayed close to Walter's roots. Bears usually roam wide, exploring for food. This one narrowed its world to one figure. Scientists would later explain it as imprinting a survival adaptation. But for the rangers walking the trail, it felt like devotion carved into mud. When they returned to Asheville that evening, the debate began. Police worried about precedent. What if others tried to keep wild cubs? The sanctuary staff argued the cub should be transferred quickly for proper rehabilitation. Yet, hospital staff, having witnessed the bond, hesitated. One nurse said quietly, "I don't think he'll survive surgery unless he knows that cub is safe." That voice carried weight. Community reaction swelled as news spread. Local papers ran headlines. Animal lovers sent emails demanding the cub stay near Walter. Critics warned of danger if the bear grew larger. The divide mirrored every debate about wildlife rescue in towns near forests. Where does compassion end and caution begin? An example from Colorado years earlier illustrated the risk. A family secretly raised a black bear cub until it reached 100 pounds. When officials discovered it, the animal was too habituated to be released safely. The outcome was tragic. That memory hung heavy over Emily's team. Would this cub follow the same path? Or could it be guided back to the wild without erasing the bond? The small lesson here is about timing. Intervening too late creates dependence. Intervening too early risks survival. Walter's case sat exactly in that gray middle. He had bought the cube time. Now officials had to decide what to do with that gift. From another perspective, the investigation revealed how much humans project onto wild animals. To some, the cub was a hazard, to others, a miracle. In reality, it was both wild and loyal, vulnerable and strong. It reminded the community that wild animals aren't symbols, they're lives making choices in impossible situations. That evening, Emily sat with Ryan outside the sanctuary office. She said, "The cub followed him into a hospital. That's not ownership. That's a story, and we have to decide how it ends. Ryan didn't argue. He simply closed his notebook. The decision, ultimately, was to allow the cub temporary sanctuary care near Asheville with supervised visits, so Walter could see it during recovery. It wasn't perfect, but it balanced law with compassion. The cub would be evaluated, given space to grow, and eventually, if strong enough, released back into Pisgah with tracking collars. And so the next chapter began. Walter lay in a hospital bed, heart stitched back to steady rhythm, while not far away the cub adjusted to a new enclosure. Staff whispered about how it pressed its nose to the glass whenever Walter's name was spoken. Journalists camped outside. Locals debated on talk radio, but for Walter and the cub, the story wasn't lore or headlines. It was the bond they had already written in the forest. The first week after surgery was slow. Walter lay in a quiet hospital room, tubes and monitors, charting every breath. His body fought to recover, stitched and fragile. The black bear cub lay only a few doors away, watched by sanctuary staff who brought food and water. To outsiders, it was an odd arrangement. To the nurses who had witnessed the hospital walk, it was necessary. On the third morning, Walter stirred awake voice, faint, asking, "Where's he now?" The nurse hesitated, then leaned close. "He's near. He hasn't left." At that, Walter's shoulders eased as if survival itself depended on that one answer. Meanwhile, at the sanctuary, on the hospital's edge, the cub adjusted to a small enclosure built with logs, straw, and shade. He paced at first, searching for the cabin he no longer knew, but when volunteers spoke Walter's name, he calmed nose pressed to the gate. Rangers explained it as conditioning the cub linked the sound to safety, but to the staff watching it, looked like loyalty holding steady through distance. An example of such parallel healing exists in therapy programs across the country. Veterans with trauma often recover faster when paired with service animals. Elderly patients regain appetite and strength when visited by therapy dogs. The principle is simple. Connection accelerates healing. For Walter and the cub, a connection had already been carved deep. Each afternoon, sanctuary staff wheeled Walter still weak into the outdoor space. The cub bounded forward only to stop short at the fence. He lowered his head ears forward, a low whine slipping out. Walter raised his hand, resting it against the mesh. "I'm still here, boy," he whispered. The cub pressed close. The moment lasted only minutes, but nurses later noted Walter's vitals stabilized each time after these visits. The explanation lies in biology. Studies show oxytocin, the hormone tied to bonding, rises when humans interact with animals. It lowers stress, slows heart rate, and improves healing. The same chemical is present in animals, reinforcing trust on both sides. Walter didn't need a chart to prove it. He felt it each time he breathed easier near the cub. From a fresh perspective, their healing wasn't separate stories. It was one process, reflected. Walter's heart repaired in rhythm with the cub's wounds closing. The man who had carried the cub now found himself carried by its presence. Not everyone approved. Critics warned the cub would grow too comfortable around humans, making release into the wild difficult. Officials debated, but hospital staff pushed back. One nurse said that cub has done more for his recovery than any medicine we've given. It was hard to argue with the steady improvement on Walter's chart. The community began to rally. Local children drew pictures of Walter and the cub, taped them to hospital walls. Letters arrived from animal lovers across the country calling the pair symbols of hope. Reporters nicknamed the cub Guardian. Though staff avoided formal naming, the public had already chosen one. An example of how public reaction shapes outcomes can be seen in Alaska's famous orphaned moose calf case, when the animal bonded with villagers. Officials at first planned removal, but overwhelming community support persuaded them to keep it under supervised protection until release. In the same way, the story of Walter and his cub was no longer private, it belonged to everyone watching. The small lesson here is about visibility. Healing is often unseen, silent days in hospital rooms, slow steps toward recovery. But when stories like this break into the open, they remind communities what resilience looks like. Walter's strength was not just measured in heartbeats, but in the way he represented persistence to those who heard about him. Psychologists visiting the hospital offered another insight. They noted that elderly patients often recover faster when tied to a purpose. Walter's purpose was no longer abstract. It had a heartbeat and fur. Each time he spoke of the cub, how he had found it, how it had followed him, his voice grew steadier. It was as if retelling the story rewrote his own strength. From another perspective, the cub's healing mirrored the man's grief. Walter had lived with absence since Margaret's passing. Now, watching the cub regain strength, he felt a mirror of his own recovery. One life stumbling back toward wholeness pulled another with it. This is what animal-assisted therapists describe as reciprocity. The helper becomes healed by the act of helping. Not all days were easy. The cub paced restlessly, sometimes refusing food. Walter struggled with fatigue, his hands shaking when he tried to lift a spoon. Yet the bond steadied them both. On one difficult night, Walter whispered to the nurse, "If he makes it back to the forest, then maybe I'll make it home too." It wasn't just a metaphor. It was a pact between man and cub. What would happen when the release came? Would the cub remember him? Would Walter accept the parting? For now, those questions stayed in the future. The present was healing step by step, heartbeat by heartbeat. Community presence grew stronger. The local paper ran updates. Wildlife photographers gathered hoping for a glimpse of the cub during his supervised walks. Sanctuary staff fielded calls from viewers across the country asking about donations, about chances to visit. Most were turned away. Safety mattered, but the flood of interest proved the story had touched more than just Asheville. And through it all, Walter kept whispering the same words each visit, "I'm still here. You're still here." That rhythm of assurance became their shared medicine. From a broader perspective, the healing of man and cub highlighted something bigger, the thin line between wilderness and community. Forest animals cross our lives more often than we admit. A deer on a road, a fox near a backyard, a black bear cub in a hospital. Each crossing forces us to decide whether we see intrusion or connection. Walter's story pushed many to choose connection. By the 6th week, Walter could walk again with a cane. The cub, now stronger, climbed logs and foraged for berries brought by rangers. Both had survived storms. Both had survived separation, and now both stood on the edge of return, Walter to his cabin, the cub to the forest. But healing is never only about the body. It's about readiness for what comes next. For Walter, that meant letting go. For the cub, that meant facing the wild again. Neither path was certain, and that uncertainty gave the story its depth. Because true healing doesn't erase scars. It teaches how to walk forward with them. Spring returned to the Blue Ridge with quiet warmth. Trees budded, pale green rivers ran full from snowmelt, and the forest floor filled with the hum of insects and the tracks of forest animals. At Asheville Community Hospital, Walter Johnson took his first steps outside in weeks. He leaned on his cane, but his back was straight. Beside him, sanctuary staff walked slowly, leading the black bear cub on a safe path toward an open truck, waiting to carry it back into Pisgah. The goodbye was not announced with speeches or cameras. It was simply a man pausing in sunlight, watching a cub that had once limped in weakness, now bound with strength. Walter reached forward, hand brushing the coarse fur between the cub's ears, his voice low but steady. "You brought me here. Now it's time for you to go home." The cub pressed against him once, then stepped back toward the forest. Explaining such moments is difficult because science can only take us so far. Biologists will tell you the cub followed Walter out of imprinting memory and survival instinct. Doctors will tell you Walter's recovery was strengthened by the presence of a creature that lowered his stress and gave him purpose. Both are true. Yet something deeper lingers. Something no chart or study can capture, the mystery of loyalty that moves between species. Examples of such farewells appear rarely, but powerfully. In Kenya, rescued elephants trumpet when released, circling back once toward the people who nursed them before fading into the savannah. In Montana, wolves raised in sanctuaries are tracked by GPS. Yet rangers often report they pause at the boundary fence before loping into the wild. That pause is not hesitation. It is recognition. The same pause filled the air when Walter and the cub faced each other at the edge of Pisgah. The lesson here is that letting go is not a loss. It is the fulfillment of care. Walter's secret weeks of nursing the cub, the storm that nearly ended him, the hospital walk that stunned a town, all of it led to this, a release not of control, but of trust. From a fresh perspective, the story is not about an old man saving a wild animal, nor is it about a cub saving a man. It is about two lives crossing at their most fragile points and carrying each other just long enough to survive. That is why people across the country read about it, why animal lovers sent letters, and why videos of the hospital walk reached millions. It touched something universal. The reminder that interdependence defines survival not just in the wild, but in us all. Knowledge gained from this story is practical too. Wildlife rescue experts emphasize that while black bear cubs can show loyalty, they must ultimately return to the forest for their own safety. Sanctuaries exist to bridge that transition. The cub that walked into Asheville Community Hospital will now grow under careful watch with tracking collars, ensuring he adapts back to his territory. Walter's role was temporary, but his impact was permanent. The cub's survival odds, once slim, are now strong. Walter's knowledge was less scientific but equally valuable. He understood that compassion given in small acts, cutting wire, offering food, staying present, creates ripples. His recovery reminded others that healing is not a solitary path. It is shaped by who or what we walk beside, whether a nurse, a neighbor, or a bear cub. Emotion filled the sanctuary. Release the staff, release the gate. The cub stepped forward, hesitated, then moved into the underbrush, thick with spring growth. Walter stood watching until the last rustle of leaves faded. His eyes misted, but his hands steadied on the cane. Around him, staff and neighbors were silent. No applause, no cheering, just respect. Would the cub remember him months from now? Would it wander near his cabin when autumn came? No one can say, and maybe the answer doesn't matter. What matters is that in the critical moment, they had found each other, and that was enough. An example of lasting impact comes from a case in Alaska, where a rescued eagle years after release was spotted nesting near the village that had saved it. Residents swore it circled above town every spring. True or not, the story carried hope. Walter's cub may one day leave no sign, or it may appear again. Either way, the hope remains. Loyalty isn't bound by species. It emerges wherever care and trust take root. We see it in dogs that refuse to leave their owners' graves, in cats that sleep on hospital beds, in wild animals that return to humans who once aided them. Walter's story fits within that lineage, reminding us that the line between human and animal is thinner than pride admits. From another perspective, this story is about community as much as individuals. Hospitals, sanctuaries, rangers, and neighbors all adapted, setting aside fear to allow a bond to play out. Too often rules separate us. Yet here, flexibility saved lives. The lesson for viewers is that compassion works best when shared, when institutions listen to hearts as well as laws. Walter eventually returned to his cabin cane, tapping against wood floors. Photos still lined on shelves. The silence was less heavy now. He walked the ridge trails again, slower, but not alone. Birds, deer, and perhaps somewhere a young black bear crossed his path. He no longer needed to hide companionship. The world already knew, and that's where the mystery turns back to us. What do we carry in secrecy that could heal others if shared? What bonds have we ignored because they didn't fit the categories we were taught? Walter's story urges reflection not only on the power of animal rescue or wildlife sanctuaries, but on our own capacity to trust, to care, to let go. So, pause for a moment. Ask yourself who or what has carried you when you were weak. Who have you carried in return? These questions matter because they shape the stories we leave behind. Walter's bond with the cub will fade into the forest, but its echo remains in every person who heard it and felt a shift in how they see wild animals themselves and each other. If this story moved you, if it stirred, memory sparked hope or opened perspective, take that feeling with you. Share it. Let it remind you that compassion doesn't retire, loyalty doesn't vanish, and even in the unlikeliest places, a hospital lobby, a mountain storm, a hidden cabin light finds its way back. And if you want to walk with us again to hear more wild animal stories that bring trust, healing, and mystery to life, then stay close. Reflect on your own journey, then click like, subscribe, and join us here. Because the next story may not be about a black bear cub, but it will remind you again that the wild still has something to teach us all.